The problem with dropping a human onto a Class 7 deathworld is a fundamental misunderstanding of marketing. The Pan-Galactic Alliance Officer Academy, in its infinite, ivory tower wisdom, had a very specific definition for deathworld. It involved things like atmospheric acidity levels, predator-to-prey ratios exceeding 9:1, and the statistical probability of being unexpectedly dissolved by sentient foliage. They had charts. They had graphs. They had tenure-track positions dedicated to studying the very specific ways a cadet could be unpleasantly dismembered on any given Tuesday. Xylos 7, the planet in question, was the valedictorian of their list. It was the planet other deathworlds got bullied by in the galactic schoolyard. Which is why, from the orbital command deck of the training vessel Unflinching Resolve, the sight on the main view screen was causing several chitinous mandibles to clench and at least one gelatinous administrator to wobble with existential distress. Down on the surface, amidst jagged obsidian spires that wept corrosive mist and flora that actively hissed at passing breezes, sat Cadet Kyle Peterson. He was not cowering in a thermal shelter. He was not brandishing a plasma repeater at the skittering horrors in the shadows. He was, to be precise, leaning back on a surprisingly comfortable-looking slab of igneous rock, his standard-issue survival tunic unzipped to his navel, using a polished piece of metal from his kit as a reflector to get a more even tan. He'd even found a way to prop his feet up. His biomonitor indicates a heart rate of 62 beats per minute, reported a junior technician, her voice a series of confused chirps. That is, resting. He appears to be resting. Drill Instructor Vrax, a being whose entire physical form resembled a pile of obsidian knives that had somehow gained sentience and a very bad attitude, took a heavy, clanking step toward the screen. His species, the Cthar, communicated primarily through controlled violence and disapproving glares. He was fluent in both. Resting. On Xylos 7. During the crucible of metal. Impossible. The human must be in a state of shock-induced catatonia. The sheer terror has overloaded its primitive mammalian brain. This sounded plausible. It was, in fact, the most generous possible interpretation of the current data. Administrator Zorp, a shimmering, vaguely pear-shaped entity from a species that had evolved past the need for bones, spines, or anything resembling a work ethic, pulsed a calm, violet hue. Or, Zorp oozed, their voice like synthesized chimes being played through molasses. The environmental sensors in his sector are malfunctioning. It is statistically more probable that our multi-trillion credit sensor array has failed than a soft-bodied primitive is, sunbathing. On the screen, Kyle shifted slightly, adjusting his reflector. He sighed a contented sigh that was picked up with perfect clarity by his comms unit. It was the sigh of a man who had just found the perfect spot on the beach, blissfully unaware that the beach in question wanted to eat his skin. You see, the Alliance had made a critical error in their assessment. They had read the files on Earth. They knew about the intermittent ice ages, the supervolcanoes, the rather alarming tendency of its dominant species to invent new and exciting ways to explode things. But they'd filed it all under historical curiosities. They hadn't grasped the fundamental truth: humans are the universe's undisputed champions of ignoring obvious danger for the sake of minor comfort. They had never been to Florida. Kyle was from Florida. To him, a world where the air was only mildly corrosive and the giant, venomous insects were at least big enough to see coming felt less like a death world and more like a gentle step up. The razor wind they'd warned him about. A pleasant, exfoliating breeze. The screaming blood moss. Just nature's way of letting you know where not to step. It was all about perspective. And Kyle's perspective, at that moment, was that he'd been on this rock for 4 hours and was starting to get some nice color. The crucible of metal was a 72-hour survival trial. He figured he had plenty of time to build a shelter and hunt for food later. First things first. Base tan. It was important. Zoom in on the life form readings around his position, Vrax commanded, his voice a low growl of grinding rock. There must be a nest of spine leapers nearby. Or perhaps a burrow of void renders. He will be devoured momentarily. It will be an excellent, if brief, lesson for the other cadets. The technician complied. A topographical map appeared next to the main image, dotted with red markers indicating hostile life. The area around Kyle was saturated. It wasn't just a nest. It looked like the annual convention for things that kill you. There were so many red dots they coalesced into a solid, angry blush on the map. Administrator Zorp pulsed an anxious shade of yellow. Instructor, by my calculations, the human is not in a danger zone. He appears to be in all of the danger zones simultaneously. Vrax's mandibles clicked in what could only be described as grim satisfaction. Excellent. The waiting game begins. The human's legendary hubris will be its undoing. Down on Xylos 7, Kyle yawned, stretched, and decided he'd had enough sun for one side. He flipped over. The universe, it seemed, was prepared to wait with him. The orbital command deck was a symphony of controlled panic, which is the only kind of panic the Pan-Galactic Alliance officially sanctions. On a dozen smaller screens surrounding the main view of Kyle's impromptu tanning salon, the other cadets were performing admirably. Which is to say, they were having a truly miserable time in exactly the way the course syllabus predicted. Cadet Gleep, a Xylopian whose body was a frantic collection of limbs and antennae, was currently engaged in a desperate, six-handed battle with a plant. It was a grabbervine, a notoriously ill-tempered piece of flora that attempted to strangle anything with a heat signature. Gleep was following Procedure 7B, Subsection 12, Evasive Maneuvers for Aggressive Photosynthesis. It involved a lot of frantic stabbing with a standard-issue nutrient paste dispenser, which was proving less effective than hoped. Gleep's biomonitor showed a heart rate that suggested his hearts, all three of them, were trying to vibrate their way out of his thorax. This was considered a passing grade. Elsewhere, Cadet Thrax of the Brundle Hive was demonstrating his species' natural resilience by being repeatedly slammed against a cliff face by a territorial rock borer. He was using his thick, armored carapace to methodically chip away at the creature's stony hide, a process that was both tactically sound and excruciatingly painful. His grunts of fury were noted in his file under Displays of Martial Spirit, another pass. And so it went. Cadets were hiding from acid rain under precarious ledges, fighting off swarms of metallic-fanged shriek bats, and carefully filtering brackish water through their survival kits. They were suffering. They were learning. They were accumulating points for grit and enduring hardship. They were, in short, doing everything right. Which made the feed from Kyle's sector all the more infuriating. After his sunbathing session, Kyle had apparently decided it was time for a late lunch. He'd packed up his reflector and ambled over to a patch of large, bioluminescent fungi. The Academy's database was very clear on these fungi. They were designated mycotoxin luminous, and while not immediately lethal, they contained a potent neurotoxin that induced vivid hallucinations, muscle spasms, and a profound sense of existential dread. They were to be avoided at all costs. Kyle was currently slicing one up and whistling. What is he doing? Vrax growled, the sound rattling a nearby toolkit. Is he preparing a meal? With the madness shrooms. Technically designated mycotoxin luminous, Zorb corrected gently. And yes. It appears he is. Perhaps his species has a natural immunity. Our data on human biology is, surprisingly, incomplete on the subject of hallucinogenic fungi consumption. This was because most of it came from carefully vetted medical journals, not from blurry videos of a music festival in the Nevada desert. Humans didn't have an immunity so much as a graded system of acceptance. Mild neurotoxin. That's just Tuesday's chili. To Kyle, the warning label, may cause a profound sense of existential dread, sounded less like a threat and more like a book club recommendation. He diced the glowing mushroom, added some dehydrated protein cubes from his ration pack, and mixed it all in his canteen cup with a bit of filtered water. He then produced a small, self-igniting plasma flare, set it to its lowest possible setting, and began to cook. The act of creating a controlled fire, a simple, contained flame for the purpose of heating food, was so primordially basic that it wasn't even covered in the survival manual. The manual assumed any cadet would use the integrated nutrient paste warmer in their suit. Why would anyone make a fire? It was inefficient, it created smoke that could attract predators, and it was, frankly, a bit common. On the command deck, a hush fell. They were watching a cadet from a warp-capable civilization rediscover the Stone Age out of what appeared to be sheer culinary preference. He has created fire, the technician chirped, as if announcing the birth of a new star. A flagrant violation of stealth protocols, Vrax snapped, though he sounded more confused than angry. Every predator for 3 clicks will be drawn to that light and scent. They waited. The tactical map remained a solid blush of red, but nothing was closing in. It was as if the local murder fauna had smelled Kyle's mushroom stew and collectively decided, nah, I'm good. Kyle took a bite. He chewed thoughtfully. Needs more salt, he muttered to himself, and dug in his pack for a seasoning packet. Administrator Zorp's form shimmered. Instructor, I have cross-referenced the chemical composition of the fungus with known human flavor profiles. The neurotoxin present is chemically similar to capsaicin, a compound they voluntarily ingest for recreational purposes. It appears he is not being poisoned. He is making his food spicy. There was a long, profound silence in the command center, broken only by the distant sounds of Cadet Gleep being methodically throttled by a plant. Vrak stared at the screen, at the human calmly eating a bowl of what should have been a chemical weapon, and for the first time in his decorated career, the drill instructor felt the unfamiliar sensation of being completely and utterly out of his depth. The human wasn't just surviving. He was having a nice little camping trip. And that simply wasn't in the regulations. The first official drone flyby was scheduled for the 12-hour mark. It was a crucial part of the evaluation process, designed to assess each cadet's shelter construction, resource management, and overall state of non-devouredness. Vrax and Zorp stood shoulder to shoulder, or, more accurately, chitin to gelatin, before the main screen, ready to pass judgment. Drone Alpha, sweeping over Cadet Thrax's position, showed a textbook survival scenario. Thrax had wedged himself into a narrow rock crevice, barricading the entrance with loose scree. His bio signs were elevated, his armor was dented, but he was alive and alert. Acceptable, Vrax grunted. He shows tactical awareness of his surroundings. B-. Drone Beta found Cadet Gleep. After finally freeing himself from the grabber vine, by sacrificing his nutrient paste dispenser, a move Zorp noted as creative but wasteful, Gleep had dug a shallow trench and was attempting to camouflage himself with mud and leaves. It was a pitiable sight, but it was by the book. Displays appropriate level of fear, Zorp noted. He is meeting the psychological distress benchmarks perfectly. Solid B. Then came Drone Gamma, assigned to Kyle's sector. The drone swept over the ridge and descended into the small, misty canyon where Kyle had last been seen. The camera feed tilted down, focusing on the heat signature from his small campfire. And then it kept tilting. And then it stopped. And then the entire command deck went silent. Kyle had, in fact, found a shelter. It was a shallow cave carved into the base of one of the obsidian spires. In front of it, his little fire crackled merrily. He was no longer alone. Sitting next to him, with the contented posture of a golden retriever waiting for a treat, was a void render. Now, let's be clear about what a void render is. The Academy's database described it as a Class 7 hypercarnivore. It stood about 3 meters tall at the shoulder, was covered in overlapping plates of black, bioceramic armor that could deflect small arms fire, and had a face that looked like someone had put a bag of scalpels in a blender and then stuck eyes on it. Its 6 limbs ended in monomolecular claws capable of shearing through bulkhead steel. Its saliva was a neurotoxic acid that dissolved organic matter on contact. It was, by every conceivable metric, a walking apocalypse. The correct response upon seeing a void render was to fire every weapon you had at it and then, when that failed, to accept your imminent and gruesome demise with as much dignity as you could muster. This particular void render was currently watching Kyle whittle a piece of wood with his survival knife. Every so often, its massive, terrifying head would cock to the side, and a low, purring rumble would emanate from its chest, a sound that could normally be translated as, "I am contemplating the most efficient way to unspool your intestines." Kyle, without looking up from his whittling, reached over and gave the void render a good, hearty scratch behind one of its auditory sensors. "Who's a good apocalypse monster?" "You are." "Yes, you are." The void render's serrated tail gave a single, happy thump against the cave floor, cracking the stone. On the unflinching resolve, Administrator Zorp began to vibrate at a frequency that threatened to shatter glass. "That is not possible," they managed, their synthesized voice glitching. The biosignature confirms it. A mature male void render. Its threat assessment rating is, well, it's off the chart. The chart ends and then there's just a drawing of a skull. Vrax was making a strange noise, a guttural grinding deep in his thorax. He was trying to reconcile the image on the screen with a lifetime of military doctrine. It wasn't working. His brain was actively rejecting the input. "The human has tamed it," he whispered, the words sounding like heresy. "Tamed it? Instructor, it is behaving like a domesticated pet." Zorp's color shifted to a frantic, swirling rainbow of disbelief. As if on cue, Kyle finished his carving. He had whittled the branch into a rough, stick-like shape. He held it up. "Okay, Buttons," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the drone's microphone. "You ready?" The void render, Buttons, let out an eager chittering sound, a noise that had preceded the dismemberment of entire survey teams. It crouched low, its whole body quivering with anticipation. "Go get it," Kyle shouted, and with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the stick out into the misty clearing. Buttons launched himself from the cave with terrifying speed. He bounded across the clearing in 2 great leaps, snatched the stick delicately in his colossal, gore-stained jaws, and trotted back, dropping it at Kyle's feet. He then looked up expectantly, his multiple, glowing red eyes blinking with adoration. Kyle laughed. "Good boy." The drone's camera zoomed in on the stick. It wasn't wood. On closer inspection, with the image resolution enhanced, it was clearly identifiable as the femur of a Kthar. Vrax made a choking sound. He recognized the clan markings. That was Scout Captain Grok's leg. They'd lost him on a survey mission here 3 years ago. Cadet Kyle Peterson was playing fetch with the monster that had eaten a Kthar scout captain, using the scout captain's own leg. Administrator Zorp's form lost all cohesion and slumped into a shimmering puddle on the floor. It was the gelatinous equivalent of a full system crash. Vrax simply stared, his warrior's mind trying to find a file for this. There wasn't one. This wasn't survival. This wasn't combat. This was something else entirely. Something baffling, absurd, and deeply, profoundly insulting to the memory of Scout Captain Grok. Administrator Zorp, having been scooped back into a semblance of their usual form by a pair of janitorial drones, was now frantically consulting every regulation manual in the Alliance database. Their shimmering surface was a chaotic kaleidoscope of colors, betraying a level of bureaucratic panic not seen since the great stapler shortage of Cycle 34. "There is no protocol for this," Zorp wailed, their voice warbling with static. Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Crucible of Metal Guidelines clearly states, cadets are to avoid all contact with indigenous fauna unless engaging in defensive measures or for purposes of emergency sustenance. It says nothing about domestication. It doesn't specify what to do if the indigenous fauna appears to be enjoying belly rubs. On the screen, as if to prove Zorp's point, Kyle was now vigorously scratching Button's underside. The void render had flopped onto its back, all 6 legs kicking contentedly in the air, exposing the one vulnerable spot in its bioceramic plating. It was a display of trust so absolute it was statistically indistinguishable from madness. "He has compromised the integrity of the exercise," Vrax roared, slamming a fist onto a console. The console, being Kthar-proofed, merely beeped in annoyance. The void render is the apex predator of Xylos 7. Its purpose in this simulation is to be a terrifying, insurmountable obstacle. It is a living representation of the uncaring cruelty of the universe. And Cadet Peterson is using it as a footrest, Zorp added weakly. Kyle had indeed propped his boots up on the creature's armored ribcage while he consulted his datapad. Vrax began to pace, his heavy footfalls a rhythmic clang of pure frustration. "This is a trick. It must be. The human is using some undocumented pheromonal agent. A chemical pacifier. It is a gross violation of the equipment manifest." He stabbed a clawed finger at the technician. "Scan his person for unauthorized biochemicals. Now." The technician, who was beginning to look like she desperately wished she'd called in sick, ran the scan. The results came back a moment later. "Negative, instructor. His bioprofile is clean. No pheromones, no sedatives, just trace elements of sodium chloride, lipid residue from the protein cubes, and mycotoxins from the fungus. So he is not cheating," Zorp pulsed. "He is simply likable." The concept seemed alien and deeply disturbing to them. "Impossible," Vrax countered. "Kthar warriors have tried to subdue void renders for centuries. We have used plasma cannons, sonic disruptors, orbital bombardment. The result is always the same, a very angry void render and several dead Kthar. And this soft, bipedal mammal achieves it with jerky and a pleasant disposition." The insult was almost too much to bear. The debate raged for the better part of an hour. Zorp argued from a position of pure procedural chaos. How would they grade this? Was befriending an engine of destruction a pass or a fail? Did Kyle lose points for failing to perceive a threat, or gain points for neutralizing it in the most passive-aggressive way imaginable? Their logic circuits were frying. Vrax, on the other hand, was convinced it was a time bomb. The creature's primitive instincts will resurface, he insisted, pointing dramatically at the screen. The moment the human shows weakness, the moment he runs out of those seasoned meat strips, it will revert to its nature. It will tear him limb from fleshy limb. They watched, waiting. Kyle yawned, told Buttons to stay, and wandered off into the mist to relieve himself behind a particularly menacing-looking rock formation. Buttons waited, perfectly still, like a perfectly trained, perfectly lethal house pet. He did not, to Vrax's visible disappointment, use the opportunity to rampage. Kyle returned, offered Buttons the last piece of his jerky, which the creature accepted with surprising delicacy, and then curled up at the back of the cave to take a nap. The Void Render settled down at the cave entrance, positioning its massive body between Kyle and the outside world, and began to emit a low, rumbling purr. It was, for all intents and purposes, standing guard. Administrator Zorp's shimmering form drooped. It appears the hypercarnivore has imprinted on him. Like a hatchling. This is an ecological and psychological anomaly of the highest order. It's an abomination, Vrax corrected. He has broken our death world. The technician at the comms station suddenly sat bolt upright, her antennae twitching. Instructor. Administrator. I'm picking up an unscheduled atmospheric phenomenon. A massive energy surge, originating from the planet's northern pole. On the main tactical display, a new icon appeared. It was a swirling vortex of angry red, and it was moving south at an alarming speed. Identify it, Vrax commanded, his frustration momentarily forgotten in the face of a genuine crisis. The technician's chirps became frantic. It's a hypermaelstrom, sir. A Class 9 cyclonic event. It wasn't on any of the long-range forecasts. The models show 100% probability of total surface devastation in the storm's path, she swallowed nervously. All cadet sectors are in the storm's path. Estimated time to impact, 2 hours. The manufactured crisis of the Crucible of Metal had just been brutally upstaged by a very real, very unscheduled, and very, very big one. The mood on the command deck shifted from academic bewilderment to genuine, high-grade alarm. A hypermaelstrom wasn't part of the test. A hypermaelstrom was what the Alliance sent survey ships to get vaporized by for scientific purposes. It wasn't something you left cadets in the path of, not even cadets you were actively trying to traumatize for educational reasons. Evasive action. Vrax bellowed, his drill instructor persona snapping back into place with the force of a plasma coil discharge. Begin emergency extraction protocols. I want a transport lock on every cadet's biosignature, now. The technician's antennae drooped. Negative, instructor. The storm front is generating an unprecedented level of electromagnetic interference. We can't get a stable lock. The transport fields are scattering by over 80%. If we try to beam them up, we're more likely to rematerialize them inside a mountain than on this ship. Zorp, who had regained some semblance of composure, pulsed a sickly green. Statistical analysis confirms the technician's assessment. The probability of successful extraction via individual transport is 37%. The probability of unfortunate molecular rearrangement is significantly higher. This was bad. This was ending up as a defendant at the Intergalactic War Crimes Tribunal, bad. Losing cadets during a high-risk training exercise was regrettable but expected. Losing them because you left them out in a planet-scouring hurricane was grounds for having your pension plan jettisoned into a black hole. There must be another way, Vrax growled, pacing the deck. The emergency extraction points. They're shielded. Can we get a stable lock on those? The primary extraction point, Alpha, is already inside the storm's initial impact zone. It's gone, the technician reported grimly. Beta is on the far side of the Great Chasm, no cadet could reach it in time. That leaves Gamma. Extraction point Gamma is located on the central plateau. It's shielded enough that we could hold a transport window open for approximately 90 seconds, but they have to get there. Then that is the plan, Vrax declared. Broadcast a Priority 1 emergency signal to all cadets. Order them to converge on extraction point Gamma immediately. This is no longer a test. This is a retreat. Zorp's form wobbled anxiously. Instructor, the terrain between their current positions and the plateau is treacherous. Cadet Thrax is separated by the river of glass. Cadet Gleep is in the middle of the whispering jungle. And the storm is stirring up the local fauna. The predator activity is spiking across the board. It was a race against time, through the most dangerous environment imaginable, with the planet itself trying to kill them. A true test of everything they had learned. For most of the cadets, anyway. The broadcast went out, a crackling, urgent message warped by the growing atmospheric interference. All cadets. Urgent. Hypermaelstrom. Evacuate. Extraction point Gamma. This is not a drill. Repeat. Not a drill. On the various monitors, they watched the reactions. Gleep, hearing the message, began to scurry in what he hoped was the right direction, his many legs a blur of panicked motion. Thrax, seeing the sky turn a malevolent shade of purple, abandoned his fortified position and began a desperate climb up a sheer cliff face. They were scared, they were alone, and they were running for their lives. Then the view switched to Kyle's sector. In the small cave, Kyle's datapad chirped with the incoming message. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The garbled warning crackled through the small speaker. He listened for a moment, then stood up and walked to the mouth of the cave. Outside, the sky was a terrifying, swirling vortex of black and violet. The wind was beginning to howl, a low, mournful sound that was rapidly rising in pitch. The corrosive mist was becoming a driving, acidic rain. Kyle looked at the sky. He looked at the terrain map on his datapad, noting the location of extraction point Gamma. It was a good 15 clicks away, over some very nasty-looking ridges. He looked back into the cave at Buttons, who had woken up and was watching him with intelligent, glowing eyes. A slow smile spread across Kyle's face. He turned to the enormous, multi-limbed, steel-rending engine of death he had been using as a pillow. "Well, buddy," he said, patting the Voidrender's armored flank. "How do you feel about giving some folks a lift?" Buttons let out a rumbling chitter and nudged Kyle's hand with his horrifyingly complex mouthparts. The gesture was clear. He was in. While the rest of the cadets were facing a desperate, lone struggle for survival, Kyle Peterson was preparing for a road trip. And he had the galaxy's most terrifying, all-terrain, acid-proof monster for a ride. The broadcast from the unflinching resolve was, to put it mildly, not conducive to calm, rational thought. It was a garbled mess of static, panicked instructions, and the occasional terrifying sound of atmospheric plasma discharging somewhere it shouldn't. For the non-human cadets, it was the final confirmation that their meticulously planned survival exercise had gone completely off the rails. Cadet Gleep was having the worst time of all. He was a xylopien, a species whose natural defense mechanism was to freeze in place and hope that its uncanny resemblance to a pile of dead leaves would fool predators. This was a spectacularly unhelpful instinct when one needed to run very fast in a specific direction. He was currently skittering through the whispering jungle, a place named for the constant, unsettling sound the razor-edged leaves made as they brushed against each other. Every snap of a twig sent him into a fresh paroxysm of terror. The extraction point was somewhere to the, well, it was in a direction. He was moving in that direction. Probably. He rounded a pulsating spore pod and ran directly into a fresh nightmare. A web. A massive, shimmering web, sticky with paralytic venom, and sitting in the middle of it was a crystal spinner, a spider-like creature the size of a ground car with far too many legs and eyes. Gleep froze, precisely as his instincts demanded. It was not working. Cadet Thrax, meanwhile, was facing a different problem. He had reached the river of glass, a churning flow of molten silicate that cut a deep channel through the landscape. The extraction point was on the other side. The survival manual had a chapter on crossing hazardous geological features, but it had been written with things like gorges and crevasses in mind, not literal rivers of lava. Thrax, being a Brundle, was famously stubborn. He was currently testing the tensile strength of a nearby petrified tree, hoping to knock it over and form a bridge. The tree, however, was stubbornly refusing to cooperate, and the air temperature was beginning to make his carapace uncomfortably hot. Every other cadet had a similar story. They were isolated, facing impossible obstacles, and being hunted by a planet that had decided to stop playing around. Their biomonitors on the command deck painted a grim picture of rising panic, dwindling energy reserves, and rapidly decreasing chances of survival. "They're not going to make it," Zorp stated, their gelatinous form a flat, defeated-looking puddle. Cadet Gleep's probability of reaching Gamma is 12%. Thrax is at 9%. The others are even lower. "We have failed them." Vrax stared at the tactical map, his mandibles clenched so tight they audibly creaked. He had sent these cadets to their doom. His crucible had become a slaughterhouse. The shame was a physical weight. "Is there nothing we can do?" "We can only wait," the technician chirped softly. "And watch." But they weren't watching the right screen. If they had been, they would have seen that not all was lost. Because in another sector, a very different scene was unfolding. Kyle had fashioned a makeshift harness out of the straps from his survival pack and some of the grabbervine he'd found lying around. The plant, he'd discovered, was quite pliable once you convinced it you weren't food. He'd slung it over Button's broad, armored back, creating a surprisingly secure seat just behind the creature's primary shoulder ridge. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. "All right, big guy," Kyle said, cinching the final strap. "Let's go round up the stragglers." He pulled up the tactical map on his datapad, which helpfully displayed the biosignatures of all the other cadets. He plotted the most efficient route to intercept them all before making a final run for Extraction Point Gamma. It looked less like a desperate flight and more like a meticulously planned school bus route. "First stop, Cadet Gleep," Kyle muttered, tapping the screen. "Looks like he's, stuck in a spider web. Figures." He gave Buttons a pat on the neck. "Okay, Buttons. To the whispering jungle. Giddy up." With a ground-shaking roar that was less a cry of aggression and more a bellow of enthusiastic purpose, Buttons launched forward. The Void Render moved with a speed and grace that defied its massive size. It crashed through the undergrowth, its armored hide deflecting the razor-sharp leaves and corrosive sap of the jungle as if they were spring rain. Trees that had been obstacles for Gleep were matchsticks to Buttons. The terrifying hisses and clicks of hidden predators fell silent as they sensed the approach of something much, much worse. For the first time in its existence, the whispering jungle was quiet, holding its breath in terrified awe. They were making incredible time. On the command deck, a new alert suddenly flashed on the tactical display. "Instructor," the technician chirped, her voice filled with a new and unfamiliar emotion, confusion mixed with hope. "Cadet Peterson's biosignature, it's moving. Very fast. Directly towards Cadet Gleep." Vrax and Zorp stared at the screen. Kyle's little blue dot was streaking across the map, closing the distance to Gleep's flashing red one. "How is that possible?" Vrax demanded. "The terrain there is impassable on foot." Before anyone could answer, the blue dot merged with the red one. And then, a moment later, two blue dots began moving away together, heading towards the river of glass. Vrax leaned closer, his multifaceted eyes wide. "What in the name of the first ancestors is he doing?" Down on the surface, Kyle was doing exactly what it looked like he was doing. He was picking up his classmates. The crystal spinner was just about to wrap the paralyzed Cadet Gleep in a silken, venomous shroud when Buttons crashed into the clearing. The giant arachnid froze, its dozen eyes locking onto the Void Render. There was a moment of primal, evolutionary calculation. The crystal spinner was a formidable predator, the terror of its ecosystem. But Buttons was an apex predator on a planetary scale. It was the difference between a wolf and a hurricane. The crystal spinner made a series of panicked clicking noises that roughly translated to, "My deepest apologies, I didn't realize this sentient leaf pile was a friend of yours," and then scuttled away so fast it left grooves in the rock. Kyle slid off Buttons' back. "Hey there," he said cheerfully to the terrified, web-covered insectoid. "Name's Kyle. Looks like you're in a bit of a sticky situation." Gleep could only manage a series of terrified whines. His translator implant rendered it as, "Death Beast, human rides the all-consuming shadow, the end times are upon us." "Right," Kyle said, pulling out his survival knife. "Let's get you out of there." He began carefully cutting the thick, sticky strands of the web. Buttons, meanwhile, began delicately chewing through the larger anchor strands with his steel-shearing teeth, occasionally pausing to slurp up a bit of the paralytic venom like it was a tasty sauce. A few minutes later, Gleep was free, trembling but unharmed. "How? What?" Why, he stammered, all six of his hands gesturing vaguely at the giant monster currently purring next to Kyle. This is Buttons, Kyle explained, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He's giving us a lift to the extraction point. Hop on, we've got to go pick up Thrax. Gleep stared at Kyle, then at Buttons, then back at Kyle. His brain, which was designed for cataloging pollen types and avoiding birds, simply could not process the situation. But the alternative was being left behind to be eaten by the storm, so he numbly allowed Kyle to help him onto the Voidrender's broad back. Their next stop was the River of Glass. They arrived to find Cadet Thrax locked in a stalemate with the petrified tree, his armor beginning to glow cherry red from the radiant heat. He was about to give up when he saw them. His first thought was that the heat was causing him to hallucinate. A human and a Xylopian riding a Voidrender like it was a pack animal. Need a bridge? Kyle called out over the roar of the molten river. Thrax could only nod, his jaw agape. Buttons, tree, Kyle commanded, pointing. Buttons seemed to understand perfectly. He lowered his head, braced his six powerful legs, and charged. There was a sound like a mountain breaking in half. The ancient, petrified tree, which had resisted Thrax's considerable strength, groaned, cracked, and then crashed down across the river, forming a perfect, if slightly terrifying, bridge. The impact sent a wave of molten silicate splashing high into the air, where it cooled into fine, glassy threads. Thrax stared in stunned silence. Kyle gave him a jaunty wave. Cross over. We'll meet you on the other side. As Thrax scrambled across the smoldering log, he watched as Buttons, with Kyle and Gleep clinging to his back, simply waded through the river of glass. The molten silicate parted around his armored legs. He didn't even seem to notice the heat. On the other side, Thrax joined the small, bewildered group. I do not understand, the hulking Brundle warrior rumbled, looking at Kyle. He had jerky, Kyle said with a shrug, as if that explained everything. And so the rescue mission continued. They picked up a terrified reptilian cadet who'd been cornered by a pack of spine leapers. The pack took one look at Buttons and decided they had urgent business on the other side of the continent. They found a silicon-based life form hiding underground and coaxed her out. With each stop, the legend grew. The human, the soft one, the one they'd all dismissed, was riding the apocalypse like a shuttle bus, collecting them all with a calm efficiency that was more shocking than the storm itself. He arrived at Extraction Point Gamma with minutes to spare, the entire cohort of surviving cadets in tow. They were battered, traumatized, and utterly baffled, but they were alive. They huddled together on the shielded plateau as the hyper-maelstrom raged around them, a wall of wind and fury. In the middle of it all stood Kyle, calmly checking his datapad, while Buttons sat patiently beside him, occasionally nudging his hand for a scratch. The monster didn't seem to mind the storm at all. It was, after all, just weather. The 90-second transport window opened with a shimmering column of blue light. One by one, the terrified cadets were beamed aboard the unflinching Resolve, their minds struggling to process the events of the last 2 hours. Finally, it was just Kyle and Buttons left on the plateau. Okay, buddy, Kyle said, giving the creature one last, firm pat. This is my stop. He stepped into the transport beam. But as his form began to dematerialize, Buttons let out a mournful, soul-shaking howl and took a step forward, right into the edge of the transport field. On the command deck, the technician screamed. Sir. The creature entered the transport field. Its biomass is 30 times the safe limit for a single subject transfer. It's going to overload The sentence was cut off as the entire ship's power flickered, lights dimmed, and the transporter emitter let out a sound like a dying whale. Then, with a final, deafening thump, the transport cycle completed. Standing on the transporter pad, amidst the acrid smell of ozone and burned-out energy conduits, were Kyle and Buttons. The other cadets, who had been gathered nearby, scrambled back in terror. Ship security officers raised their plasma rifles, alarms blared, and the entire vessel went to red alert. Vrax and Zorp arrived on the scene a moment later, pushing through the crowd of panicked officers. They stopped dead. There, on their pristine, sterile transporter pad, was a human cadet, looking slightly sheepish, and a 3-meter-tall death machine that was currently sniffing curiously at a floor panel. There was a long, heavy silence, broken only by the frantic beeping of a dozen overloaded systems. Kyle cleared his throat. He gestured with a thumb towards the void render, who had just licked a bulkhead and seemed pleased by the metallic taste. "Sorry about this," he said, with the casual air of someone apologizing for tracking mud into the house. "He's house-trained, I swear." "Mostly." Vrax's mandibles opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. He looked from Kyle, to the monster, to the terrified faces of the other cadets who owed their lives to this bizarre duo. He looked at the scorch marks on his transporter pad. His entire worldview had been systematically dismantled and reassembled into a shape he no longer recognized. Administrator Zorp, however, had found their voice. It was the quavering, high-pitched tone of a bureaucrat faced with a form that has no appropriate boxes to check. "Cadet Peterson," they shrieked, their gelatinous form jiggling violently. "You have brought an unauthorized, undocumented, Class 7 biological entity onto a military vessel. This is a catastrophic breach of quarantine protocols. And logistics. Do you have any idea what the paperwork for this is going to look like?" Buttons, perhaps sensing the administrator's distress, ambled over and gave Zorp a gentle, curious nudge with his snout. Zorp let out a synthesized squeal and instantly destabilized into a puddle again. "What? How? Why is it not killing us all?" Vrax finally managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was the question on everyone's mind. Kyle shrugged, reaching into a pouch on his belt and pulling out a small, foil-wrapped packet. "I told you. He likes jerky." He unwrapped a piece and tossed it to Buttons, who caught it deftly. "This is the hickory-smoked kind. It's his favorite. I think he was just lonely. Not a lot of folks on this planet are into playing fetch." The sheer, unadulterated mundanity of the explanation was the final blow. They hadn't been saved by a warrior. They had been saved by a guy from Florida who was good with animals. In the end, Kyle Peterson received the highest marks in the history of the Crucible of Metal. Not for survival, his instructors had to invent an entirely new category for him. He was awarded the Grand Star of Valor for extravehicular logistics, unconventional asset acquisition, and interspecies crisis management. The Academy Board tried to argue, but they couldn't get around the fact that he'd had a 100% success rate in saving his fellow cadets, a record that was, until now, purely theoretical. Administrator Zorp spent the next 3 weeks designing a new set of forms for non-hostile indigenous fauna interaction, with multiple appendices for scenarios involving spontaneous domestication and use as emergency transportation. They were never used again. Drill instructor Vrax quietly retired the femur of Scout Captain Grok to a place of honor, relabeling it from a relic of a fallen warrior to a monument to the day we learned that sometimes the most effective weapon is a well-seasoned meat snack. And Buttons. After a lengthy and very confusing debate, he was officially registered as Kyle's dependent. He became the first and only Void Render to serve in the Pan-Galactic Alliance, listed on the official roster as a search and rescue specialist. He spent most of his days lounging in the cargo bay of Kyle's assigned starship, chewing on discarded engine cowlings and waiting for someone, anyone, to throw him a stick. Which, as Kyle often reminded his new crewmates, was much better than him chewing on the power conduits. Mostly.